Well, thanks for having me. And look, on the economic side, the oil price shock obviously is a big risk for Pakistan. It's already in an IMF program. That program has been quite strict for the last few years for Pakistan, and from the Russian war onwards, Pakistan has faced the brunt of inflation, in part caused by high energy prices. So I think, from the point of view where Pakistan is right now, a protracted increase in energy prices where crude oil remains above 80, $85 for the next few months will most certainly cause an economic shock to the country. And it exposes once again the structural vulnerabilities that the country has, in particular as they relate to the dollar flow in the country. Exacerbating this further, if we sort of game this out and talk about higher energy prices, is the risk to remittances, because unlike the Russian war, in this case, if you assume that oil prices will be sticky on the higher end, then they, by extension, are sticky because of the protracted conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States. As a result of which, the Gulf economies continue to suffer because of the insecurity and the drone and missile attacks that they've been facing. And through that, then it's a second order risk of saying, if those economies contract, then what happens to the labor that works there from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. And so Pakistan, unlike the Russian war this time, faces the two-front economic challenge, one on the energy price and second, potentially on the remittances side as well. It's likely to do that. I think there should be revisions made to that outlook. Again, we're in March already, so the fiscal year is close to ending. So it's not that this current fiscal year will face the big downturn. But again, for the next fiscal year, the government has to project some level of impact as a result of this. It also has to take into account a potential of, let's say, subsidies or higher Benazir income support program payments, etc., for which I think that's part of the conversation ongoing with the IMF about how do you deal with this supply side shock and price shock that Pakistan is facing. So I think this budget process all of a sudden became a lot more complicated for the finance ministry. And it will be interesting to see how Pakistan engages with the IMF on this, balances between the need for austerity along with the need for relief and economic activity at home, and how quickly does the country's policymakers sort of course correct as and how the crisis evolves. Well, look, the first thing I would say, and I think in Pakistan, obviously, for a lot of people, the price hike was deeply unpopular. But from an economic point of view, I thought that this was a good decision and a timely decision and an effective decision by the government, despite the unpopularity of the move, to prevent hoarding, black marketeering, etc., to happen. If you look across the border, for example, in India, over the last few days, because their government did not move as quickly as the Pakistani one, there are LPG shortages, black markets popping up, etc. So first up, like, I think that decision was right, even though it may be unpopular and even though it has had a material impact on people's lives in the country. In terms of access to Russian crude, I don't think there is any discounted oil anymore on the planet. So I don't think that is going to be procured. I think the one place where Pakistan can get some, not a discount, but some relief is primarily with Saudi Arabia, where a potential new oil facility could smooth over the outflow of dollars as a result of a price hike. And I think, and I'm pretty certain that those conversations in closed doors are already happening with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I think the third point on rationing and how do you deal with this moving forward, I think so far the posture has been good in terms of encouraging work from home, shorter work days, school holidays. But again, the broad agreement across Asia and Asian governments right now is they can do this and hang on for another couple of weeks. But if this war continues to linger beyond that, then obviously everything is off the table. And I think that's where Pakistani policymakers should be, and I assume they are looking at worst case scenarios and how to deal with that, and how to make sure that they do not end up not just on an energy pricing shock, but also a shock where shortages and illicit markets crop up because of lack of supplies in the country. I think they can sustain this for a bit of a longer period. I don't think the real issue is shortages. The real issue is the price shock and the balance of payments impact that we talked about earlier. I think it's also been encouraging to see the fact that very early on, Pakistan was able to work with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to get access to cargoes via Yambu. So those cargo ships are there in Karachi now. And I envision that if this conflict continues, and let's assume that in the next couple of weeks, the Houthis start to also signal that they may try to stall the flow of traffic via the Red Sea, then I anticipate that the Pakistan Navy will participate in task force missions as it has in the past to secure that supply route. And again, that will reinforce Pakistan's ability to secure the high seas as and when needed. But I think for the time being, the presence of cargoes, the outflow of oil from Yambu into Pakistan is a good sign, and I see that continuing as a means to offset the closure of the Strait of Hormuz for Pakistani supplies. I think it's again too early to say what kind of emergency support may come Pakistan's way. But if one were to assume that by and large the country remains within the confines of the IMF program, doesn't go down the route of a disastrous fuel subsidy program that we've seen in the past, then I think should push come to shove, Pakistan will get that support, not only from the IMF, but other allies and partners as well. Because at this current juncture, the contagion effect of the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran is very real. And I don't see any regional or global actors wanting to have a situation where countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka get destabilized as an outcome of this conflict. So I envision that if the policy posture is prudent in Islamabad, which again so far all indications are they will be prudent, then I don't anticipate a prolonged crisis causing something like what happened in 2022 post-Russian war, at least at this point in time in Pakistan. Well, so first up, look, the LNG from Qatar is not coming, right? And so that has to be offset through either domestic production, curbs to production, or coal imports as well. Now, that means that from a overall, if you hold everything constant point of view, the LNG price shock doesn't really impact the country because there are no cargoes coming in. Now, the opportunity there is, and again, this is something 3 months ago, a lot of folks in Islamabad were complaining about, which is the solar revolution in Pakistan. Well, the solar revolution in Pakistan, with summer around the corner, actually helps this situation because people have invested in their own production, businesses have invested in their own production, and solar is free, no imported energy. You use the energy from the sun, and so that's a good thing. That the shock Pakistan has had in the past has led to businesses and households adjusting. And I anticipate that the debt problem in the electricity side should not impact the country as much as it would have 3 to 5 years ago. I think the one thing to keep in mind over here now, again, is that the country still cannot afford to go down this path of freezing electricity prices because of higher overall fuel costs and the average cost adjusting upwards. So as long as that posture is maintained, the circular debt can be controlled. From what I've heard in Islamabad also is that there are attempts being made to accelerate the energy transition in Pakistan on the electricity side to reduce dependence on imported fuels even further. So I anticipate that the country is well positioned, provided in Islamabad you don't go down the path of freezing prices. Because again, freezing prices may sound good in the 3 month period, but they lead to a hangover effect across the entire energy system that the country cannot tolerate at the moment. So look, on the Central Asia, Russia route, those are TBD, and the holdup there is Afghanistan. Pakistan is currently in a state of war with Afghanistan, as we all know. So I sort of put that to the side in terms of where things go. The opportunity for Pakistan actually is, and that has been taken by businesses and households since the Russian-Ukraine crisis, is that investing in renewables, whether it's rooftop solar, whether it's battery storage, is good, it's efficient, and it makes Pakistani businesses globally competitive. So I anticipate that this shock coming into the system again will only further accelerate the renewable energy revolution Pakistan has seen. Now, it is up to the government to look at this as an opportunity rather than something that has to be curbed by limiting net metering or anything else, and say, okay, we have in Pakistan indigenous growth of solar. How can we accelerate that? How can we accelerate the growth and investment of battery energy storage systems? How do we get two and three-wheeler EVs on the road and build a charging infrastructure? So these are all opportunities. And I think that given what this crisis has exposed in terms of the vulnerability of energy supply chains around the world, Pakistan and Pakistanis ought to think a bit more creatively about solving this problem. And I think from the fundamentals point of view, this is an opportunity for the taking because Pakistani households have gone through a hard lesson over the last few years and are ahead of the curve. And now it is up to the policymaker to pour to proverbially use the term fuel on the fire of this renewable revolution in the country. Also, I would put sort of the states in the Arabian Peninsula into three buckets. The closest ones to the Strait of Hormuz, let's say countries like Qatar and the UAE, will be the harder hit ones here because not only do they rely on export of energy, urea, and other outputs from their energy ecosystem, but they also rely a lot on logistics and on tourism for their economy. So all of that has come to a grinding halt. And so economically, they will face strain. Now, the upside for them is that these are very wealthy countries with a lot of sovereign wealth funds, huge amounts of dollars in their reserves. So they can, navigate this process far better than others as well. The second bucket are the ones that will be impacted, but in a limited fashion. These are countries like Iraq and Saudi Arabia. They have alternatives. Saudi Arabia, in particular, as we talked about, has the Red Sea outlet that it has been investing in. Also, large economies on their own can sustain and survive and are used to some of this volatility in the region. So that's the second bucket. And then the third bucket are the Arabian countries that are at risk of facing economic shocks, much like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc. And those are Egypt and Jordan in particular, but also Syria, for example, which has just come out of a civil war. So I think in those countries, the risks are pretty much the same. High energy prices, can't provide subsidies. Egypt obviously has been in an IMF program, has required Saudi and Emirati and Qatari bailouts, etc. So I think that's where the region is. So in the near term, they have these three buckets of challenges that they all face. In the medium to long term, they will all now face the question around both diversification of their economy as well as their supply chains. Building that route, let's say, into the Red Sea is going to be key, but also looking at their own defense industrial complex. Because what the war has also revealed is that the US is a good security umbrella provider, and its technology can and does help them remain secure. But when supply lines are stretched, they don't want to be holding the short end of the stick with interceptors running low, etc. Right? So what I anticipate in the medium term is that all of these economies will look inwards. Rather than buying football clubs, so to speak, in England and in France, they will now start investing in their own supply chains, working with countries like Turkey and Pakistan to enhance their own capabilities at home. I fundamentally 100% agree. I think the opportunity for Pakistan is multifold from this crisis. On the security side, obviously, deepening the relations with Saudi Arabia will be key. That has all sorts of implications for a defense industrial and innovation complex that can be built in a trilateral way. The second opportunity for Pakistan is on logistics and transportation. For the last 3 to 4 decades, Karachi, which used to be at one point the hub for the regional transportation, aerial transportation industry, has lost out to Dubai and Abu Dhabi, etc. Well, now here's an opportunity for Karachi to be that hub again, or Islamabad to be that hub between Europe, Central Asia, and East Asia, right? A route that is largely secure in the airs right now. So that is another opportunity for Pakistan to think about and be a bit creative about. And then I think thirdly is an opportunity for Pakistan to look at its own indigenous energy sources, of which there are quite a few. They haven't been underinvested in, and sort of say, okay, if Strait of Hormuz can be this flashpoint and a choke point, can Karachi, for example, or the coast of Balochistan, for example, play that alternative role? And in my mind, the answer to all of those questions is yes, there's an opportunity for the taking. The challenge is, how does Islamabad and policymakers in Pakistan think about what is now on offer for them? To an extent, yes, but I don't think it's reached a crisis point yet. And part of the reason for that is twofold. One is that the United States has become a global exporter of energy, particularly petroleum products, as well as LNG. So the United States has a lot on its own that keeps it sort of, unlike East Asia, unlike Pakistan or Europe, sort of insulated from this. Then, of course, there's the Venezuela point that Venezuelan oil is coming back online. So that has a particular role to play. I think the second thing on the United States side so far has been that the electoral clock is sort of down the road in November. And that gives the president a little bit of room where, if he wants to expend political capital, let's say for the next 4 weeks in this war, then by the time November comes along, and assume he achieves his objectives, of which there's a whole debate going on, right? Then it's good for him. So that's their calculus, right? On the Iranian side, of course, the expansion of the theater and the use of asymmetric war to wage an economic war essentially is having an impact. It is leading to fissures here in the United States. And now I think it's a race against time for both Iran and the United States to see who has greater will to continue down this path, but also who has more material in terms of warfare to continue choking the Strait of Hormuz, and or opening it on the United States' side, and how that is done. I think that's what we're going to find out in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, and I think the reason for that, right, is that this was a war that the president chose on sort of going down a path that many of his own allies were not super focused on and were not bought in on. In fact, even the Arab states were not fully briefed on where this was going to go. So now that there is a need for greater support, and the president is asking for it, well, no one was prepared, number one. Number two, this war is deeply unpopular in the United States and in Europe. So why would they go down this path? And number three, at the end of the day, compared to the United States, these countries don't have much to offer. I mean, even if you look at the British Navy compared to its heyday, it is a shadow of what it used to be. So what is Great Britain going to provide here, right, materially, that the United States cannot do on its own? So I think that call basically is a signal that the president is trying to get other countries to come in and support and be part of this coalition of the willing, so to speak, kind of like Iraq. But unlike the Bush administration, he didn't do the hard work of convincing even the coalition of the willing to come in on Iraq in this instance, right? So I don't see that going anywhere significant. Countries may pay lip service to the fact that, oh, we might send some naval vessels to the Red Sea to escort, etc. But for the time being, it is up to the US Navy to do something to open up the strait. And I think they do have the capability. But the question is, what kind of costs are you willing to bear to do that, which is also what the Iranians want, right? They want to bloody the nose of the United States in that naval strait. And we'll see whether that conflict evolves into a naval battle in the next few days or not. Well, so for them, the risks so far are far more muted than other countries because the Chinese have been building their own strategic reserves. They have built the pipelines and the infrastructure with Russia. Even since the last round of this conflict last year, they continued to double down on that route, knowing that this was a choke point and a problem for them. So I think they overall can survive this much better than a lot of other countries, including Japan and South Korea, but they will feel the pain too. Bigger than that for them is the strategic sort of implications of this conflict, because the choke point risk of the Strait of Hormuz is the same choke point risk that was there with the Suez Canal, with the Panama Canal, and with the Strait of Malacca, right? So for the Chinese now, it's like, okay, if we cannot field our own blue water navy, and these choke points are virtually dominated by the United States, then what do we do? And so I think they will be watching very carefully what happens moving forward between Iran and the United States. Because if the Iranian threat is neutralized by the United States in the coming days, then that will worry Beijing quite a bit. In the sense that American dominance, even on the Strait of Hormuz, has been restored. So that's what I would be looking out for, is how the Chinese deal with that. And from an energy perspective, they will double down into Central Asia and Russia to have those alternative supply routes moving forward.